All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today. My name is Mike Lagerquist. I'm here with at Vine Faith in Action. Today, we're very excited to have a renowned poetess in our presence. Susan Chambers is a Vine member, so that's great. We see her here quite a bit, and she's also well known amongst the writing set here in Mankato as well as at Vine. So she approached us about doing something about everyone is a poet. Sometimes you just need a little prompting, or you need to know how to get started, and that's what she's here to share with us today. So I will take this opportunity to thank Susan for offering and for presenting today, and I will slide back into the background.
All right. Thank you, Mike, and I hope everyone can hear me. I will apologize now. I can mute a number of my phones because I am in my office space right now. But if a fax comes in or something, it might get a little noisy, but I'll try to make that minimal. So I'm not expecting any today. So I like to start any talk I give by telling you that poets break the rules all the time. Everything I say today could be wrong for you. It might be right for me, but not right for you. I love Richard Hugo, who has a book called The Triggering Town that talks about different ways of triggering writing and poetry especially. So just keep that in mind, that there's nothing that I say is sacrosanct to poetry. In fact, poetry is everywhere. I don't know how many times I have been approached by somebody who says to me, "Oh, Sue, I don't like poetry, but I like your poetry." And what that tells me about them is they just hadn't found the types of poetry that they like. And we'll talk more about that. But poetry is everywhere. And poetry is what people turn to with those big events in their lives, the emotional times that are so important. So people who don't write poetry normally will, at the time of a graduation, a funeral, a wedding, those big emotional blocks of time, call out for poetry. I'm going to start with a poem called How to Become a Writer, and this is one of my own. How to become a writer. You need a pair of dogs, preferably large, the type who accompany you, are not walked. We move in early gray, ignore thick dew turned frost on the roofs. Dogs forage ahead 3 telephone pole lengths. They poke black noses into gopher holes, bound across cut bean fields after stray mourning doves. It takes a partner whose mouth puckers duty. One who views word passions as a waste of time, a wanton throwing of money better spent on taxes and mortgages. Someone whose eyes flicker boredom if you ask to read your newest, whose muttered nice hangs over tea chilling in the cup. You need a handsome father who demands that you excel in what he knows is important, who thinks scribbling is tolerable as a hobby, but a writer embarrasses the family. There is the requisite yellow pad, blank pages full of tomorrow, filled pages a disappointment to be flipped over quickly. You might be burdened by the hole left by a friend 5 states away, the one who sends articles, whose scrawl in your books stops you at the first page of your selection so that your fingers can trace the loops and trailing tail of her name. You need a cold moon to tap closed eyes at 3 a.m., an orb that pushes against the muscle's cry for sweet unconsciousness, a light that propels you up the heat of bed, draining away with each step down to your desk. You need a dead brother whose gun returns to the back of all the lines you write while a moon drifts west unmoved. There should be a clock, most likely with chimes, to remind you of tomorrow's appointments, the press of demands of your clients, all those faces who claim they paid good money to keep you from your yellow pads, books, friends, and this sleepless yearning. Well, that phone wasn't mine. So let's start with a few basics about what a poem really is, why it's different than prose, novels, and some of the other things. And obviously there's some ways that even the children, when I do Young Writers Conference, learns. It's often short. Most poetry is stanzas and short and 1 or 2 pages. Rather than paragraphs, although there are exceptions to all of it. Sometimes it is rhymed, but not all. Sometimes it has tools that help us get to the sound of music. There's always music in the words. What type of music is sometimes different. There are as many types of poetry as there are types of music. And so when somebody tells me they don't like poetry, all I can think is that they've been listening to country western or hard rock or classical when they are a folk music type person. And there are different types of poetry that will strike their ear, and they will invite them into the world of poetry. So just have to keep trying and find what it is that rings your bells. If I had to try and define myself, I would say sometimes I'm jazzy, sometimes I do a little classical, sometimes I'm new age, sometimes I'm folks. I do like to put nature in my poetry. I like the emotion or what the Webster's Unabridged Dictionary talks about as far as what poems are. There are facts, images, and emotions in a style that's much more concentrated. I think that is very, very true. You don't have a lot of excess words in poetry. Obviously very imaginative at times. You invite the reader in by bringing them along on the trip, and that takes sometimes really moving. But they are powerful. They tend to end with a real kicker. This is a quote from me from a while back saying, you know, you've got to work at your poetry when you start writing poetry, and you've got to give it as much attention as you would to your family, your house, your children. However, sometimes it's not a bad thing to be a little lazy in poetry. Emerson, Whitman, are really a sort of a free flow of ideas, and that type of poetry is just as good as those that have worked and reworked a poem. Most of the time, my poems are rewritten. I have some poems I've rewritten for 7-10 years before I'm satisfied that I really have them at their best. But some come just full blown, just something that really inspired me and need very little changing. Although I've even found I have had a couple fortunate wins in some national contests in their grand prize competition. And one year I got an honorable mention in that category. And I looked at that poem and I thought there was one word in the last line that needed changing. And so I changed it and was able to submit it again, and it won first place the next year and gave me $1,500 for a poem. So sometimes you've got to spend the time on the rewrite and decide if that makes the difference. So what is poetry as opposed to prose? I think it's more basic. It's much more primitive. It goes to the emotions that are important to us. It's sensuous. It's rhythmical. Poetry can do that in as little as one paragraph or one line at times. We do use a lot of tools in poetry, and probably the biggest is metaphor. That is comparing one thing to another. And a metaphor is probably better than simile, which is using like or as for a comparison. But they really invite the reader into the poem. If you can get a metaphor in your works, you're going to find that people are much more likely to respond to you. It has some type of beat or rhythm in it. And again, that's that concentrated, getting rid of the words that aren't necessary so that it flows with some type of music. And sometimes it has rhyme. I'm not much of a rhyming poet on the end lines. And I think that sometimes when people tell me they don't like poetry, they're looking at poets who 200 years ago were all rhymed, and that's what the teachers see as poetry, and that's what they teach. And it doesn't speak to our modern people who may do more free verse. When you look at some of my poems, you will see there's a lot of rhyming within internally, and that's just a part of the ear. It's the way my ear hears things. I think one of the biggest things about poetry is to have image in it, and you bring the images to home by using your senses, by telling us what it looks like, what it smells like, what it tastes like, what it touches, using all five senses, what it sounds like. That is what invites a reader into the poem and makes them feel like they are a part of what is happening. And the images, the more concrete they can be opposed to abstract, the better. So when you are saying in a poem, oh, look at the flowers, you're not going to get much of an image. But if you say roses compared to dandelion, you really change the poem. The more specific you can be, the more concrete you can be, the better you are. Look at those abstract words and try to take them out of the poem. When you say I'm angry or I'm happy or I'm sad or any of the emotion telling words, they don't invite the reader to participate. You need to give concrete examples of what makes somebody care about a poem. Again, this is another quote from Richard Hugo. A lot of times what we do today, we're going to do a little writing exercise, I hope you'll all try, is maybe a trigger. And that's what he talks about with his triggering town in that book. But that's just to get you going. That's to help you write. And oftentimes I eliminate that whole first stanza that was the reason I started writing, because it's not the real subject. And as I begin to work with things, I realize what the real subject is, and then I go for the guts. And that don't be afraid to jump ahead is important to make a poem. There are a number of books out there that can help you look at forms, can help you look at the craft of poetry. There's just many. I just threw this one up because it is somebody who I'm not sure if this book is in circulation anymore, but it's been around a long time, and it has many different forms that you can open up and try, and that can be a trigger. But there are so many different poets who have written a book on the craft of writing poetry. And I encourage you to get one or two of those books. And a number of the names I've talked about in here today are people who have done a book on the study and writing of poetry. So there's a big difference between telling and showing. And I thought one of the easiest way for me to show you that would be to give you a classic internet poem. This gentleman actually put his name on this, but I took it off because I'm using it as a bad example. My sweetheart, so often when I'm embracing you, it seems that you exist in this world only because of me, and I exist because of you. It's not easy to wander in this world and not lose one's way, but the greatest happiness of all is in giving joy to one's beloved. And if the king can have his throne, and if the bird can have his spring nest, and God can have his heaven, then I, my sweetheart, I can have you. It's a wonderful, wonderful expression of love, but he didn't work at his poetry in making it image strong or golden. He used the telling words rather than showing us what made it happiness, what was the joy. He didn't even give us the type of bird. A crow is going to be so different from an oriole, those types of things. He just didn't work enough. This is the start of a poem, and the emotion was there that triggered him writing it, but he can turn this into a much better ballad. And I'm going to go on by showing you somebody who has done this. And of course, I took a negative on her emotion rather than the love, but I go back to May 1937. This is by Sharon Olds. And you can tell her trigger. Her trigger was a picture she had in her hands. I see them standing at the formal gates of their colleges. I see my father strolling out under the ochre sandstone arch, the red tiles glinting like bent plates of blood behind his head. I see my mother with a few light books at her hip, standing at the pillar made of tiny bricks, the wrought iron gate still open behind her, its sword tips aglow in the May air. They are about to graduate. They are about to get married. They are kids. They are dumb. All they know is they are innocent. They would never hurt anybody. I want to go up to them and say, stop, don't do it. She's the wrong woman. He's the wrong man. You are going to do things you cannot imagine you would ever do. You are going to do bad things to children. You are going to suffer in ways you have not heard of. You are going to want to die. I want to go up to them there in the late May sunlight and say it. Her hungry, pretty face turning to me, her pitiful, beautiful, untouched body, his arrogant, handsome face turning to me, his pitiful, beautiful, untouched body. But I don't do it. I want to live. I take them up like the male and female paper dolls and bang them together at the hips like chips of flint, as if to strike sparks from them. I say, do what you are going to do, and I will tell about it. So you can see how strong the emotions become because she let herself take risks. She started with a trigger of a simple picture that she was looking at, and looking at her own experiences in life, she begins to tell very concretely what is going on. We get the May air, we get the tiny bricks, we get even in her language, which is what I would call telling, bad things, suffering, you're going to want to die, there are still clues that are going way beyond just a telling. There's a great strength to this poem. She uses some of the tools. She uses repetition. Her pitiful, beautiful, untouched body, his pitiful, beautiful, untouched body. There's a music to those words that she used in there. And she goes for the juggler at the end. She really is strong. She takes the risks. She tells it all. And it's a poem about writing poetry. This is a quote from William Stafford. He a favorite poet of mine, although I have so many favorite poets, it's hard to say that. But he has a wonderful book called Writing the Australian Crawl, which talks about writing as is the same way you learn to swim. If you think about it, you'll just sink in the water. And what you have to do is just relax when you get in the water and float and just go, and then the water will hold you up. And that's the same with writing. You can't be thinking about this is the way it has to be and this is the way I'm going to write it. You just have to start writing. So it's a process to bring new things that you would not have thought of. And so Stafford really took that a long ways. He wrote almost every day of his adult life. And he wrote about whatever was around him. And I'm sure there were lots of days when he just threw what he wrote out, but he also got some wonderful poems by taking the risk and just beginning to write about whatever was around him. Mary Oliver is another favorite poet of mine, and this is a very short poem, again, which is very full of very strong images. Praying. It doesn't have to be the blue iris. It could be weeds in a vacant lot, or a few small stones. Just pay attention, then patch a few words together and don't try to make them elaborate. This isn't a contest, but a doorway into thanks. And a silence in which another voice may speak. Again, the silences in this poem, the pauses between the ideas, give it a whole greatness that just looking at the individual lines might not let you see. But I love the very specific blue irises versus weeds or stones. And there's a surprise in all of this, and that's probably the best poems are ones that surprise you because they go in directions you didn't expect them to go. And that's what Stafford is talking about. Let yourself go in directions you never expected to go. Another favorite poet, Ted Kooser, he just announced that he is no longer going to do the Sunday poem a week that he's been doing for quite a few years. He's a past poet laureate, and he's out of Nebraska, and he's in his 80s now. I'll miss him because I thought his selections each Sunday, and they were in the Free Press, the Sunday Free Press every week, have been just incredible. This poem is the trigger that I think we can all write a million poems on, Mother. Mid-April already, and the wild plums bloom at the roadside, a lacy white against the exuberant, jubilant green of new grass and the dusty, fading black of burned-out ditches. No leaves, not yet, only the delicate star-petaled blossoms sweet with their timeless perfume. You have been gone a month today, and have missed 3 rains and 1 night-long watch for tornadoes. I sat in the cellar from 6 to 8 while fat spring clouds went somersaulting, rumbling east. Then it poured, a storm that walked on legs of lightning, dragging its shaggy belly over the fields. The meadowlarks are back, and the finches are turning from green to gold. Those same 2 geese have come to the pond again this year, honking in over the trees and splashing down. They never nest, but stay a week or 2, then leave. The peonies are up, the red sprouts burning in circles like birthday candles, for this is the month of my birth, as you know, the best month to be born in, thanks to you. Everything ready to burst with living. There will be no more new flannel nightshirts sewn on your old black Singer. No birthday card addressed in a shaky but businesslike hand. You asked me if I would be sad when it happened, and I am sad. But the iris I moved from your house now hold in the dusty dry fists of their roots green knives and forks, as if waiting for dinner, as if spring were a feast. I thank you for that. Were it not for the way you taught me to look at the world, to see the life at play in everything, I would have to be lonely forever. Now, he uses metaphor a lot in this poem. There's a lot of comparisons of one thing to another, and personification in his metaphor too. The irises, green knives and forks waiting for dinner. There's an emotion in this. If he had just told us, I'm lonely because my mother has died, we wouldn't have been invited into this poem. But to have the spring storms tumbling across him, the tornadoes at night, and sitting in the cellar, we are invited into the whole experience. There are images that have been popped up in poetry that are memorable forever. This is one of those one-line poems by Ezra Pound. In a station of the metro, the apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. Ezra's done something else in this. There's a slant rhyme. Crowd and bow are not exact rhymes, but they have a music to them, and they're very close in sound. And even in just one simple sentence, you have such a vision of those faces in the crowd and petals on the black bough. I think I first met this poem when I was in the 6th grade, and I suddenly realized how significant poetry could be because of seeing this here. And here's another one. This one's a little bit harder, but again, the image is so strong because you asked about the line between prose and poetry. Sparrows were feeding in a freezing drizzle that while you watched turned into pieces of snow, riding a gradient invisible from silver aslant to random, white and slow. There came a moment that you couldn't tell, and then they clearly flew instead of fell. And I think we've all, especially in Minnesota, had that day of rain suddenly becoming snow and totally changing. And there's more. Even though this is just about the change of seasons in there, there's an emotion under it. That loneliness that we heard a little bit from Ted Kooser and from others, that melancholy maybe of the change of seasons, and yet also an awesomeness, but Mary Oliver, that gratitude, that thankfulness that you are there to see it and create it. So that's Howard Nemeroff. All right, I'm going to do a couple of my poems, and then we're going to do some writing. A change of ground. Walk with me down this old gravel road through the oaks to the river. In the wind, we will hear their voices rise on spring sun waves. They will stroke our cheeks with the alive of water, the new smell of earth. Their green will brush our sadness, mellow it warm. They come back to us with summer birds absent for so long a stretch of white. Songs will swirl around our slight smile. Walk with me between fields and waiting maples. Feel the change of ground beneath our feet. Although in our grief we still anchor in North Ravine snowdrifts, there are woodland flowers on the edge of melt. and the dogs run grinning along heated black furrows. Again, using the environment around you to show, rather than saying, I'm lonely, I miss people who I've lost in my life, and yet spring makes me feel more joyous. Those types of things, if I'd said that, would not have been a poem. But working with the gravel road, the river, the oaks, the maples, the feel of the ground underneath you and how it changes, and the melting, can say it for you. So trust to the images that are around you and let them be what you have. There'd be a real temptation, I think, of some newer poets to write the whole thing and do the images and then at the end say, I'm really talking about my family who's gone and I miss them. You don't want to do that. Take that last stanza out and just go with the images.
Hey, Susan?
Yes.
Would you be open for questions as you're going through?
Sure. Do you have
All right.
any there? Or? But
Right,
we're getting down to writing here pretty quick. So, okay. This one is from my book called Good Thunder, Blue Earth. It tells the story of 3 generations of one farm family, and it goes through a number of seasons. It actually, Twin Rivers Council for the Arts did it as a reader's theater piece with all the characters. There's a cast of characters of about 8, I think, different people, different voices. So I wanted, because I've been reading snow poems to you and summer poems and spring poems, I thought I should get into the season that we are in. So this is a love poem by Jake, Nearing Culmination. There is only flame bush color where the sun was. High above us, the moon is abreast, nipple bright, fullness hidden in blue shadow. We porch sit, listen to night sing. The crickets chant harvest. All plants hold their breath. The earth smells moist. Jo sits close. Her lips are wet from sips of sweet plum wine. There's a new depth to her eyes, a thick swing to her hair. We feel the sharper wind, short summer already slipping around the corner of September. I know it is almost time. Almost. 1 week, maybe 2, until the crickets are just the right tenor, until the air will wait no more. Then we can gather up summer. Then we can look to winter bed. It is almost time. Almost. In the dark, I reach out, stroke her cool skin. I typed that one in a hurry and I see a few typos in there. Please forgive me on those. John Ciardi has another good book on writing poems. And he says one of the best things you can do is lots of studying. Read the works of others. Find what type of poetry speaks to you. Listen to them, go to open mic readings, and now there's still a ton of open mic readings out there on Zoom. We have local chapters that write poetry, where again, the Southern Minnesota Poets Society meets the second Saturday of every month. They're meeting this Saturday on Zoom, and anyone can join them and come and listen to poetry, share if you want to share. You don't have to share, but come. And then write on a regular basis. My daughter and I did an exercise where for 1 year, and actually we went about 1.5 years, we assigned each other a trigger. We just had a notebook that was in the kitchen, and I would do one day, she would do it the next day. And we gave each other permission to write the worst junk ever, but we wanted to write. And we got a lot of poems, hundreds of poems by the time we'd finished. Right now, the League of Minnesota Poets, which is the state organization, it has a pandemic poetry that they're doing. They're giving assignments to each other. And again, people can pass and say, no, I don't want the stress of this, or they can read others and share what they're doing. But it's just a way of getting in there and writing. So that's probably the most important thing, is you just have to write, because if you play editor in your own mind, you'll never get anything on paper. So now we're going to do a little writing exercise. And what I want to do is use Natalie Goldberg's rules of writing practice. Natalie Goldberg has 2 great books on writing poetry, and they have a lot of triggers in them. The Wild Mind is what these rules come from. The other one is called Writing Down the Bones. But they are some great rules, and they're pretty simple. Rule number 1. Once you start writing, keep your hand moving on the paper. Don't take time to erase or cross out or change things. Just keep writing while you're doing this inspiration. The people you see in this are people that I was on a writing retreat in Ireland with. It's a great group of people. So there's a few Irish poets here. Rule number 2 is to lose control. I talked about that earlier. You want to take risks. If it feels scary when you're writing about it, that's something you should really write even more. You should go in a little bit deeper. You want those real risks. You want to take the risks. I can remember a poem I wrote that Grandma had been quite sharp with me, but that didn't make a lot of sense to say that. So I made her slap me in the poem. That never really happened in real life. And if I'd used my editor on me, I would have said, oh, I can't do this. But I needed to for the poem. It made the poem much, much stronger. And sometimes you just have to take those kinds of risks or lose the control. Well, number 3 is, as you're writing, try to be as specific and concrete as you can be. Don't use general words like trees. Pick a cactus or a weeping willow or an oak tree. Don't just use grass. Tell me if it's brown, is it tall, is it short, is it lush green? Don't use flowers. Roses are so different from dandelions. Don't use cars. A VW is not the same as a BMW. Don't use streets. Tell me if it's potholes. Is it a busy highway? Is it a dark alley? All of those types of specific things are really going to invite you into the experience more. So start even when you're writing long. If you use the word flower in your thing, throw in rose, tulip, different flowers, and just keep writing. Rule number 4 is don't think. This is where you want to tell your editor to take a back seat. They shouldn't be there. If we all waited for, oh, I really shouldn't write that, and crossed it out, and we'd never get anything on paper. You need to just go with it and not think about it. Often, if I don't have anything else to write about, I look at my hand and then I start describing my hand and just write. I don't know what's going to happen with that when I do that, but it gets me going, and it gets me out of thinking about how I should write and saying, nope, I just want to write. Don't worry about punctuation, spelling, grammar. Don't edit it. Don't worry about how it looks. You'll do those at a later time when you're not in inspiration, when you're doing a rewrite. And I am a strong rewriter. I do a lot of rewriting, but not in that first triggering of wanting to be inspired and to get something on paper. And give yourself permission to write the worst junk ever. You don't have to write an epic poem. I mean, again, a lot of times I enter contests on a national basis, and if I looked at a contest that had a subject of world peace, for example, I'd freeze up. You just have to give yourself permission to go anywhere else and to write. You just give yourself that permission, and guess what happens? You end up not writing junk. You end up with good poems. And you end up surprising yourself because you start with your hand and you end up the hand becoming part of world peace. And then go for the juggler. That is that taking that risk and talking about the things that scare you and really writing into them, even if you say, oh, this isn't very nice, my doing this. That's okay. That will give you some extremely strong poems. And you had some examples of some very strong poems because the poets that I read to you were willing to take that risk and go for the really strong, scary things. So I want you to free the poet within you. Again, these are people dancing in Ireland, and we're going to do a little dancing in Mankato today. So for this writing exercise, I want you just to take out a piece of paper. I want you to use the 5 senses. There were a number of poems there that were addressed to a specific person. Ted Kooser's mother, Sharon Olds, was talking to her parents. I think even mine had, talking to about family. So go ahead and think about addressing a specific person in your life, and start addressing them. Use the 5 senses, and that's a great way to start, even if you don't know what you're gonna say to them, if you're not sure what you're going to do with it. Go ahead and try to get something that smells, tastes, touch, sight, sound. Get them all in there. And don't forget that those senses can be metaphors too. Sometimes we don't know what happiness tastes like, but you can make that up. You can use your imagination and stretch it. And then try for specific concrete language rather than just general stations. So what I want you to do now is to take your piece of paper, think about the person, and following Natalie's rules, which is start writing, and once you start writing, just keep writing, don't lift your hand. And let's write for, let's see, it's 2:45. We go till 3:30, is that right, Mike? Okay, so I will check back in with you in 10 minutes and see where we're at. Okay, so go ahead and write. And I'm gonna write too. How are we doing? People got some writing in? Were you surprised by the way it went because you let yourself not be an editor? You'll have to unmute yourself if you want to talk, but I'd like to hear. Anyone got any surprises?
Yeah, Susan, this is Sandra. I thought, I didn't know what I was going to write, and then it just started coming. And the direction you gave to just keep writing, it did just keep coming without having to sit back and think what words to use. Now, maybe if I look at it and rewrite, it'll be different, but it was kind of amazing how it worked.
It can be very, very inspiring. And when I write, I tend to use a yellow pad. I like my yellow pads, but some people write on computers. But if you look at this, during that time, I got 2 pages. And my poem is not going to end up being 2 pages. I will begin to now work on rewriting and tightening it. But it's just letting yourself go and finding those surprises that is so important, and getting yourself to that strong punch at the end can just really, really do something. I like addressing emotions to a specific person too. There's something about that I think when I talked about poetry often works with the big emotions, the weddings, the funerals and things. It's the same with specific person. If you're picking a person to write about, whether it's the stranger in the street or your mother or your father, who we bring a lot of baggage with that, it allows you a lot of freedom to really work and go in surprising directions.
I found myself going back, you said to keep writing, but then I was out of sequence. I started imaging one thing, but then I had to write. So my second images actually chronologically ended up coming before my first. Because one would think of actually, and I just scribbled basically, and just got down some images, and then it's when do I see those images, and when do I feel them, and then I ended up writing about shedding the busyness of. I started to write about Ted's French onion soup. Because I love it, and he's making it tonight. But then I was remembering how when I came home from school, I would shed the busyness and I have driving north on Warren, east on Balzerzac, north on Monks, and east on Meadow. And then when I opened the door, is it the warmth or the smell of the soup baking in the oven that I come to? So I started with soup, and then I had to go back to past history, and then I had to come back. So it's chronologically, it makes no sense at all.
But sometimes that's fun to put things out of the order, because that can be the surprise too in the poem. And when you start the rewriting, you begin to look at, will this distract the reader because it jumps too much, or will it help the reader by the time they get down to the bottom? That brings us up to things like titles. Titles for me are the last thing I ever create. And I often at this stage will write 4 or 5 things across the type. I have no title on mine right now at all, because I'm not to that point. But what you want the title to be, I think, is an aha moment. And what I mean by that is it should invite you into the poem. I wonder what this is about, and as you read, and then when you get to the very last line, you go, aha, now I understand why that title is the title. You can make a title a label, just, to introduce something, but I think you have, as a poet, an opportunity here to really create an aha moment by spending some time on that title. And sometimes I will take the line that maybe was out of sequence, Barbara, and say, oh, that's the title, and I won't repeat it again. You don't want to repeat it. Why waste your best creativity? You want to make it even stronger by not doing that kind of repetition. So that's another thing when I work with kids. Often they will use their first line or their last line as their title, and that's not a good idea, because it takes away from the poem. And I won't say that I haven't looked at what I put down as my first line and turned it into my title, but then I don't repeat it. I just move right into that next chronological piece and we'll go from there.
Say, Susan,
Mm-hmm.
are you done with the PowerPoint? Wondering if we just move back
Yes,
to.
I am.
There we go.
I'll stop sharing. Yeah,
Thank you.
because that was it. Yep. Yeah. Hey, there's everybody.
Yeah, it's always nice to see everybody.
Okay, well, I'm gonna read another poem. Mary, you got something?
Yeah. Hi, Susan. This was fabulous. Thank you so much. I'm always learning a lot. So poems didn't come as much as like Mother came to mind. My mother just turned 100, so there's lots of quality there. And I started with writing down several emotions, and then was like writing images. So I wasn't, quite ready to move to poetry as much as some photos came up and thinking about her, and so I was just writing ideas and tried to use the prompt to keep writing, which I think was useful, and just wanted to share that.
Yeah, and take a look at Natalie's book, because she would say that's a great start. But for the real inspiration, you gotta just start writing a poem or a prose piece, whatever it is. and keep going with it rather than just the images. Because when you do just the little images, you may be letting the thinker take over. The editor, the thinker, saying, oh, is this good enough or isn't this good enough? Keep writing. I think some of the best writing exercises like this is where you have to go for even longer than 10 minutes. 10 minutes, you can start to get something. If you sat yourself down and said, for half an hour, I'm going to not lift my hand from the paper. I'm going to keep writing. I'm going to put page after page down and go for half an hour, you'd be amazed where it goes. You may end up with 3 or 4 poems by the end of it, but try the exercise. It's a great one. And I think Natalie's books are easy to find, Natalie Goldberg's.
Yeah, I have both of them. In fact,
Yeah.
I took a writing, I sat in her kitchen with 4 of us when she was just getting started. And that's really amazing. I can do that with nonfiction, and just keep writing. Poetry is like escapes me, and this felt like more than I've done in the past.
Yeah. Well, another thing I like to do, that if I'm feeling kind of dry, and you get dry days, I'll sit down and I will read a favorite poet. I'll just pull a book of poems, and after you've read 15 or 20 poems, guess what? You find yourself in a different frame of mind, and then you try this exercise or try a trigger of any kind, and you'll find you can write in poetry rather than nonfiction or fiction or something else. So
I'll try it.
all right. Anyone else want to share anything?
I guess for me, it's kind of, oh, sorry. It's just like my personality type is, I can't remember if this was the initiator, but I'm one of these guys who needs to get something started, and that's when I can start making changes to it. I can't sit and think it all the way through. I need to make the changes on the fly. So this process for me was unusual for poetry, but of course, as a newspaper reporter, that's the way I always wrote. In part because it was early with computers, the computers would crash. So you would put down 2 or 3 paragraphs, you would save it, close it, open it up, and then I found that I would start at the top and reading it and kind of use that momentum to get the next paragraph or 2.
Yeah, that works. Mary, did you have a
That's how
comment?
I write too. I'm sorry, Mary, I was just responding to Mike. That's how I write also.
Yeah, what
I
I
wanted-
found was, for me, seemed unusual. My trigger was some pictures and letters of my grandmother and grandfather when my grandfather was going to serve in World War I, and so that was kind of her feelings. And then all of a sudden I realized I was doing his feelings instead of hers. It just kind of drifted into that. And I was really surprised at how it changed all of a sudden. So
You may have 2 poems in there too.
Yeah.
You have Grandma, maybe part of a whole series. It's coming. The way my farm poems started with a couple, and I can remember my mother was a poet too, and she's been gone 20 years, but I called her and said, I'm not sure what I'm doing, but I've got 3 or 4 poems. And then about a week later, I called her and said, now I have 15 poems, and now I've got 20. It just kept growing because I wasn't sure where it was going, and it took a long time, 10 years to get the right order and play with the chronologicals and things to make it all come together. But you just got to go with it. When Grandpa is calling out to you, you don't want to ignore him.
I guess so.
I was just going to mention that I was writing, and it was going very smoothly. And then it was like in the back of my mind, have you used enough sensory images? Have you used metaphor? Have you?
Those are great questions to ask afterwards. Now, you know, I go back, I was addressing it to my sister and I had a lot of metaphor, but I'm not sure I've got all the senses. Now I'll go back and I'll start adding some of that on the, you know, that's when I start writing along the corners of the page and things, and I'll put in those sensory and make sure I've got them there. You know, especially if you're looking at it and you're going, gee, everything in this is a sight and I really should have a smell. Smell is so powerful, and we don't write about smell as much as we write about some of the other, we write about sound and the sights pretty well, but you know, the touch even too is another one to do. So, all right, I thought I would share a poem that actually is one I told you I don't often not rewrite, but this one came almost completely. I think it's been maybe tweaked 1 or 2 lines, but very little. And it was a writing workshop at one of our writing retreats, and I think it was a blizzard writing retreat, so it was January and very, very cold. And one of our poets had just brought a bunch of pictures from magazines and just had us sort through them and pull the picture. And this is what I got out of that. And yeah, it's gone a long ways. This was part of the written and spoken word award. I took 2nd place in that, where you submitted 4 poems and you had to read them out loud as well as submit the written one. And it also won up in the Twin Cities, and I was up at one of the big bookstores in Lake Street. I can't remember the name of it right now, but and read it. Thong of the Bikini. Girl, oh girl, look at you. You don't care how blue the sky is. It don't matter how far from the waves you are. You don't care that you're all back and legs, all back and legs bubbling up your rounded shoulders, string taut to hide only that which you really wouldn't mind showing, but have carelessly covered. Oh, girl, your mound slightly blushed as you bend away, unmindful of muscles that slope easy and loose, your arms firm as you slather coconut oil. The sea sings a samba. The sand hears. It trickles over to you, creeps closer, rolls into the slits of your toes. The brown toast of your foot wraps around your chocolate shadow. The Brazilian beach beats a noontime tempo of coffee skin and song of you, girl. Again, there's a lot of not rhyme in this, but a lot of alliteration that creates the beat by itself. And there is a lot of internal rhyme in there and slant rhyme that does that. And on the page, it looks, it's one of the few that I have at times, I don't know, I can't get close enough to it. Sorry, to deal with it. I've done this one centered in the page as well as to one side. I think the editor here decided he wanted it that way, even though I'd centered it. But you get to play with those things when you're, and I may have played more with that than I did with changing words, because the words came pretty fast off of a picture of a bikini girl from Brazil, So you never know what the trigger is going to be. There's a lot of fun things. If any of you want the assignments that we've done for the pandemic poetry assignments, there, I would be glad. I can email them to you because I've got attachments. So if there's anything there that you want,
Yeah.
just email me if you would at schambersmediator@yahoo.com, and I will just attach them. And in fact, I think I think I'm due to do an assignment. We do an assignment every day, and if you want to be on the emails, doesn't mean you have to write anything, but you would get the notices of that. And what we usually do is, I try to do them every day, but I can't always, and other people are supposed to also help me by giving assignments, and they don't always, but sometimes they do. So sometimes we get a little bit ahead, 4 or 5 days, and then you won't hear from us, and then we'll do 4 or 5 again in a row. That's the way we handle them. So, and like I said, on the second Saturday, the Southern Minnesota Poets meet, and that's a Zoom. And again, if you want to join us, everyone is welcome at that. And I think this one on this Saturday is going to be an open read. So people are going to bring their poems and read and talk about the year. And we're talking about doing a postcard poetry project they're going to tell us how to do that on Saturday, and that's at 1 o'clock, I believe. And we're shortening the meetings just because there's so many Zoom meetings out there. So I think it's set for an hour and a half, I think is how long it'll be. So Mira, did you have something?
I do. I have a question, and in this case, is particularly the Mary Oliver poem that you shared, Praying.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm curious about is line breaks and stuff. And in that poem in particular, that things were shifting back and forth. And I asked someone who did a lot, is it called enjambment, when you have like a couple letters, a couple words at the end and then goes on to the next line. And I asked this person, like, how do you decide where to break it? Or, oh, it's just what I'm feeling like, or whatever. And I love Mary Oliver's work, but it really stood out to me, when you shared that poem, Praying, that she was doing that a lot. And can you speak any to like line breaks and things like that?
I'm a performance poet too, obviously. I like to read them out loud. And so I am grateful to writers who give me a hint about how it should be read and where the pauses should be. I'll make my own decisions about where I think a breath needs to be, eventually. And some poets just play with. I know there's some poets that will write always in couplets, and it's in jam down to the next stanza and stuff, and you're going, well, why do you have it in couplets? I think that is a time when the poet is a thinker. When you are rewriting a poem, the shape it is on the page should be deliberate. There should be a reason why you're putting it in the shape you're putting. I have found through the years, I used to do a lot more spacing out to show a pause and that kind of thing. And I'm sure I was influenced by E.E. Cummings. And I don't know if you've ever looked at a complete works of E.E. Cummings. He starts out very traditional with sonnets, and then the next few poems you start looking at, he's taken out words all over, and then he starts cramming them together. I mean, he did all the experimentation you could possibly do on how something appears on the page. And I used to be really influenced by that, and I used to have pretty wild. Now I don't do that very much. I've got a whole series of divorce poems, and I have one divorce poem about a woman who kind of falls apart in the middle of things. So the first page is very strict and is in nice stanzas, and the second page is all over the places, and it makes sense, but it was done very deliberately. It was done with a purpose to show how scattered things had become. And I tend to do it that way now. I will push something in if I want a special pause or a special breath in the middle of it, because or I want to give an emphasis to one word in particular, but the word better be a good word in order to give it an emphasis. If it's just a small sigh, the word sigh itself has that. You don't probably need to do anything else. There's a poem I have of my daughter who doesn't like snakes at all, and I like snakes. And that poem I did do like a snake. and it trails off at the end into the tail. You know, so there's times when you deliberately decide to do something, but for the most part, I now I do stanzas, and I do look when I'm first typing my poems. I will look and go, oh, look, I've got 6 stanzas, and the first one and the last one have 4 lines, and all the ones in the middle have 6 lines, except for this one, which has 8. Then I'll go back and I'll start to tighten it and give it a form for a reason, and to play with it. But those are all rewrite things, and you're definitely in your thinking part of your brain at that point. You're really doing the rewriting with what makes it look better on the page and what will have an appeal. It shouldn't, and often when you're doing that, that also tightens it up and makes it better, makes it stronger. The last thing I like to do, and you know, when we do our writing retreats, we always read around. We share what we've written, knowing it's not yet a poem. But when you read it out loud for the first time, you get all sorts of things that you didn't hear before. That, oh, this jars, this line just goes on too long, or this one is way too short and should have been a little longer. And you begin to start rewriting that way too. So you got to read them out loud. Poetry is, I think, an oral as well as a written form. Well, it's 3:21.
That went fast.
It did, yeah. So, well, it was fun, and I hope you feel free to share with me anything you got out of it. I'd love to look at it and hear about it. And if you want any of those things, just send me a little email, and I'll link you up with some sources here. But there's a lot of things out there. I know we were talking about Natalie Goldberg. Natalie's been doing a series of workshops, and I don't remember how I got tied into them. We've watched a couple of them, and they've been writing exercises too. She's down in New Mexico. And I think if you just type in her name, they'll pop up what's there. But if they don't, I can go back and look. I can't remember right off the top of my head which organization was doing it, but there was no cost to it. It was just, you had to register and sign up for it. And she was working with it. And I think they did what Michael talked about. They recorded them, so you can go back and look at the recorded ones too and participate.
Susan, would you share your email again?
Yeah, it's my name, S. Chambers. There's an S on the end of Chambers too. S. Chambers Mediator at yahoo.com.
Thank you. Thank you.
If you should happen to forget it or it bounces back or something, just let me know. I can get it for you.
Yeah. Well, happy writing.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Susan. We'll let you know if we want you to come back and teach us some more.
Yeah. Well, there's lots of different things we could do. So we could do one all on rewriting, or we could do lots of different things. So be glad to do that. All right.
Well, thank you all for coming today, and Susan for presenting.
Bye-bye. Thank
Thank you for hosting.
Thanks, Susan. Bye.
Bye-bye.